Hello, welcome back to Through the Trapdoor. I'm Katie.
And I'm Emily.
And this is our podcast where we read you Harry Potter fanfiction.
Yes.
With tree noises.
Yes, please excuse the background noises. This week we have tree noises because our neighbors are taking down trees. It's always something.
Always something.
Always something.
So we haven't seen each other in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Because I went camping.
And then Ben and I went to Maine.
So, how you been?
Good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nothing super exciting happened. I did make it through camping on the lake without a sunburn.
Ooh, look at you go.
Chapter 14, The Alley and The Cottage.
Ooh.
It was with a collective sense of exhaustion that 4 bleary-eyed teens woke that next morning to persistent hooting and pecking of several large barn owls. "Oi! Oi! Get off!" Sirius shouted, waving his arms wildly. The owl nearest him hooted indignantly and took a snap at Sirius's ears. Sirius howled, and a pillow came flying at him across the empty fire pit. "Shut up, Sirius," Melody mumbled, disappearing into the depths of her sleeping bag. Lily cracked open an eye and saw James fumbling to untie one of the letters from the leg of a very large owl. "Oh boy, James," Lily said before rolling over and burying her face in her pillow. Sirius, who is now wide awake, was cursing under his breath, helping to retrieve the rest of the letters from the owls. The owl that had snapped at Sirius earlier now hooted angrily and took a snap at him again before flying off. The rest of the owls followed suit. "Oi, Melody!" Sirius shouted. "Letter!" When Melody did not emerge, he threw it at her, and it bounced off her sleeping bag, and a grunt came from within the bag step, and a hand snaked out to retrieve the letter. James, who had not been attacked by an owl, was not nearly as annoyed as Sirius, and therefore did not chuck Lily's letter across the fire pit, but rather walked over to her and gently placed it on her pillow. He was about to walk off when Lily, eyes still closed, mumbled something incoherent and grabbed his pant leg. She declared. "James most certainly is not going to have sex with you," Sirius said indignantly. Lily, though her eyes were barely open, managed to shoot him a monstrous glare in Sirius's direction, then slowly sat up. "Breakfast," Lily croaked, eyes half closed, still groping for James's pant leg. "You going?" "Yeah," James replied in a voice that suggested the deep necessity for more sleep. Lily nodded and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. "I'm coming with you," she said, and James offered a hand, to which she took and used it to yank herself to her feet. "Melody, are you coming?" she asked, as she and James, followed by a still muttering Sirius, shuffled past her sleeping bag. Melody grunted in an extremely annoyed fashion, which Lily took to mean no, though she did stick her hand out of the sleeping bag and grope a bit before finding Lily's pillow, which she promptly dragged into her sleeping bag and buried her face in. This action caused Lily's letter to skid across the ground. Lily retrieved it before walking with Sirius and James, who both still had their letters in their hands, down to breakfast. The first clock they encountered pointed to 7, and Lily sighed, wishing she had a chance to grab just a bit more sleep. James and Sirius seemed to have similar sentiments, as they groaned when they saw what time it was, and elected not to talk the entire way down to the kitchen. They preferred to eat in the back kitchen, not the formal dining room, and Lily followed them blearily. "Juice," Lily moaned, taking her seat near the end of the table. Immediately, several glasses filled with different colored liquid appeared in front of her. She surveyed her choices sleepily. She chose the most familiar-looking liquid, the orange one, and enjoyed the sensation of sweet juice and chunky pulp as she swallowed. "Toast?" she demanded, setting down her glass. "Jam? Butter?" "Wow, you're good at this," Sirius said, impressed. "Bacon," he ordered, and then, when the requested item appeared, tried with Mount Everest. He paused a moment, expectantly, then, "Damn." Lily and James were too sleepy to manage adequate laughs. James looked at his place and considered. "Milk?" he requested. "Cookies? Hot fudge sundae?"
James.
I mean, we've all had a hot fudge sundae for breakfast at least once in our life.
Of course.
As well as Oreos and milk.
Yep.
Lily gave him an odd look as he dug into his sundae, but he just shrugged and kept eating. As they ate, Lily stared at her Hogwarts letter, and looking just the same as it had for the last 6 years, it was different. It was the last one she'd ever get. And on top of that, it was the most important Hogwarts letter she'd ever received. It alone held Dumbledore's decision on whether she'd be head girl or not. And truthfully, she was terrified of opening it. Despite her adherent protests over the years that she'd never be head girl, that her grades weren't good enough and that it didn't matter to her. Well, it really did matter to her, a bit more than she was willing to let on. And her marks the previous year had been so very close to perfect. She gulped, and not just to force down the bite of toast she had been mulling over. "Serious?" she said rather evenly. "Aren't you going to open your Hogwarts letter?" Sirius froze mid-bite, his mouth stuffed with bacon, and looked at her. "Arf," he replied and swallowed. "Aren't you going to open yours?" Lily attempted to shrug nonchalantly, but did not quite pull it off. "Oh, maybe later," she said quickly, unwisely stuffing another bite of toast into her mouth, which sent her stomach turning. James rolled his eyes. "Don't worry, Lily. I'm sure you're a head girl." Lily's head snapped around, and she had stared at him intently. "How do you know? Did your dad say so? Has he been talking to Dumbledore?"
Lily, calm down.
I mean, I might freak out too, but... No, James replied, and Lily's face fell. "But you're going to be head girl. Everyone knows it." "You can't say that, James," Lily said quite shrilly. "I don't know that." "Jesus," Sirius said, looking as though he was going to bang his head against the table. "Why don't you just open the letter for her, James?" "Yes, why don't you just open it for me, James?" she demanded, shoving her letter at him. "Oh, no," James said, holding up his hands so Lily could not shove the envelope into them. "I don't want you to rip my head off if you're not head girl." "You just said I was going to be, James, so what are you so worried about?" Well, hey, if you believe me all of a sudden, why don't you open it?" Ignoring James, Lily threw her envelope on the table, sat back, crossed her arms, and stared at it. "Oh, look, Prongs, she's going to open her envelope with psychic powers." Lily snapped her head and looked at Sirius, then at James, then back again. "Why are you calling him Prongs?" Sirius and James looked at each other for a moment. "It's just a nickname, Lily," Sirius said. "Nicknames happen." Lily's gaze continued slipping back and forth suspiciously between James and Sirius. "This isn't some code name for some new prank you're pulling, is it? I thought you had given up on..." "What do you take us for, Lily? Of course we have. Why, we haven't pulled a prank in nearly..." "Why don't you just open your Hogwarts letter then, Lily?" James said quickly, snatching Lily's letter from the table. "Wait a minute," Lily snapped, snatching it back. "When was the last time you pulled a prank, Sirius?" I think it was about..." Sirius began. "I really think you ought to open your letter," James insisted, grabbing for it, but Lily held it out of his reach. "And I really think you ought to let Sirius finish his sentences," Lily retorted, looking at Sirius expectantly. "Like I was saying..." "Damn owls!" Lily, James, and Sirius, who were annoyed at being interrupted yet again, jumped as the kitchen door banged open and Melody entered, looking furious and clutching a very crumpled copy of the Daily Prophet in her hand. "Don't those owls believe in beauty sleep? I need coffee!" she yelled, sitting down. "Like you need beauty sleep," Lily muttered, reflecting upon her own appearance. She had put her hair up before going to bed, but now some of it had tumbled down in tufts and were sticking out in odd places. She was sure there were deep circles under her eyes, and she could feel a pimple forming on the side of her nose. Compared to last night, she probably looked like the Wicked Witch of the West, except for the whole green skin thing, and the pointed hat, and the broom, and the warts, and... Okay, so the Wicked Witch was a bad example, but she looked more like a hag or something. The point was that Melody had no room to complain. She still retained some of her supermodel-like aura from last night. Her hair, at least, was not bushy and frizzy and sticking up everywhere. It lay straight and silky as ever, cascading to her waist. That is some long hair.
Yeah, it is.
That's too much hair.
So long.
Like my hair, I feel like, is too long and I just got a haircut. Cascading to her waist in an almost artistic fashion. True, there were circles under her eyes, red lines on her face from sleeping on an oddly creased pillowcase, but still, she was more presentable than Lily. "What are you waving in the air, Lily?" Melody asked, frowning over top of a heavily creamed cup of coffee. "My Hogwarts letter," Lily replied, lowering her hand, and James was no longer trying to grab hold of the letter. "Ooh, let me see," Melody said, setting down her cup of coffee and reaching across the table, and lifted the envelope from Lily's hands. It's thick, she noted, breaking the Hogwarts seal. Lily stared at her as she opened it, her hands gripping the edge of the table as Melody removed several folded pieces of parchment. Anne unfolded them, scanning the letter in silence. With no sign that she'd seen or felt any kind of badge indicating Lily's appointment or not as head girl. Her lips moved slightly as she mumbled the letter to herself, completely oblivious to the fact that Lily was staring at her so intently that her eyes were beginning to bug out of her head.
Lily, calm down.
Melody, Sirius said, finally sighing, why don't you tell Lily if she's head girl or not before she has an aneurysm? What? Melody asked, glancing up at Sirius and then at James, and finally looking at Lily. She jumped slightly at Lily's on-edge appearance. Merlin's pants, woman, here! Melody tossed the empty envelope across the table at Lily, who caught it, feeling confused, and at least until her hand hit the solid object between the folds of parchment, she shook her envelope rather more violently than necessary, and presently a shiny silver badge landed face down in her palm. She turned it over and simply stared for a moment at the glinting letters spelled out, Head Girl. Oh, she said, rubbing her thumb slightly over the badge. Well, that... She looked up, smiling crazily. James, open up yours. What for? Grumbled James. Dumbledore's not going to make me head boy. I cause way too much trouble. Oh, just open it, Lily insisted, shoving James's envelope into his hands. James sighed and ripped the envelope open. Out fell several folded pieces of parchment and a shiny silver badge, which landed on top of James's ice cream. He stared at it for a moment. James, don't just sit there, Lily cried in exasperation, and she removed the badge from James's sundae and wiped it off with a napkin. James took the badge back from Lily and shook his head. Is Dumbledore bloody insane? James, watch your language! All the teenagers jumped as Miss Potter padded into the kitchen wearing a fuzzy blue bathrobe and matching slippers. Sorry, Mum, James mumbled, returning to his eggs. When did he get eggs?
I was just thinking the same thing. Where did these eggs come from?
What?
Why are there eggs?
You had a sundae. Mrs. Potter quickly spotted the head boy badge James had discarded by his plate and began exclaiming about it. Oh, James, this is wonderful. Your father will be so proud. He was head boy in his day, you know. Ugh, Mom, get off, James grumbled as his mother attempted to hug and kiss his cheek and ruffle his hair. Mrs. Potter quit her attempts at physical contact, but did not give up her verbal assault. Oh, I'll have to owl your father right after breakfast, and we'll have to go to Diagon Alley today. Make sure you wear your badge, James. We'll buy all your school things. Mum, I'm old enough to go shopping on my own. And maybe a present. I don't need you to... Present? Mrs. Potter beamed. Let's go then, James exclaimed, and began shoving his sundae into his mouth so quickly that Lily was afraid he'd impale the roof of his mouth with his spoon.
Where'd the eggs go?
I don't know.
There were eggs, now there's not eggs. We're back to the sundae. This is very confusing.
This is a very interesting breakfast.
I like how she corrected him for using language, but not the fact that he's eating ice cream for breakfast.
I mean, I feel like she's probably given up on trying to correct his diet at this point.
True.
James, that's rude. Be patient. I'm not going anywhere until after I've eaten, and it won't be until long after you're done, especially if you insist on eating like a pig. What are you eating anyway? She asked, sinking into the chair at the end of the table. Nothing, James said quickly, and had a house elf remove the dish. Mrs. Potter frowned and decided to ignore it. Oh, Lily dear, she exclaimed, having spotted Lily's head girl badge. We'll have to get you a present too. Oh, no, that's all right. Don't be ridiculous. I want to. I'm sure if my mother wants to. Oh, I'll talk it over with her, dear. But I do really insist. Well, all right, Lily said, shrugging. Mrs. Potter beamed at her as well. Lily smiled and looked down at her badge. Her mother would be so proud, and her father would probably have taken her out for ice cream like he had after. Oh, her father. Lily felt suddenly as though someone had clamped a cold metal hand around her heart. Her father would not see this. He would not give her a big hug and take her out for ice cream like he had after she had gotten first place in the science fair in primary school, or after she had made a complete fool out of herself at her first ballet competition, or after she had gotten into Hogwarts, or made prefect, or after any special event in her life, really. Lily? James asked, nudging her with his elbow. Are you all right? Lily looked up and nodded, then picked up her badge again and stared at it. It's just, my father would have loved this. He would have been really proud. She managed her throat tightening of its own accord. Nobody said anything. There didn't seem to be anything appropriate with which to cut through the silence. Then, unexpectedly, he is proud. Lily lifted her eyes and saw Melody looking at her across the table, her eyes unnaturally bright, and Lily nodded slowly, accepting Melody's full meaning. Yeah, Lily. Yeah, Lily agreed. Really proud. Every day, Melody replied. Sirius, James, and Mrs. Potter looked on with particular expressions on their face until Miss Potter said, He'll always be with you, dear. Then Sirius and James watched as the woman had a silent, teary conversation, which persisted until Lily said, I'm going to get dressed, and left. She walked slowly up the stairs, digesting the morning and preparing herself for the trip to Diagon Alley, her first real trip to the Wizarding World since the attack. Several hours later, Diagon Alley materialized around Lily in a flurry of ash and flue powder. With a small amount of apprehension, she stepped out of the fireplace and looked around. Behind her, James and Sirius fell out of the fireplace shouting, and Mrs. Potter materialized behind them, shaking her head. Pick yourself up, boys, she instructed, and waited patiently for them to get to their feet. Now, I have to go to Gringotts, so you all can just look around for a bit. I expect I'll find you at Quality Quidditch Supplies in about an hour. Quidditch! Exclaimed Melody, who had just stepped out of the fireplace. All of the teens looked particularly eager to be getting along to the Quidditch store, so Mrs. Potter bade them farewell and shook her head again and watched them rush along Diagon Alley in a fury of excitement. Lily, Melody, James, and Sirius all fought to enter the Quidditch store, and it was James who managed to squeeze through first, and then the rest of them stumbled in afterwards. Melody, James, and Sirius immediately began gawking at the display in the window with the brand new racing broom from the makers of the Nimbus 1001. The Nimbus 1002. Ooh. Ooh. Lily, thoroughly unimpressed, and also had an irrational fear that if they caught her looking at a broom for too long, they'd try to force her on it and make her fly. Lily was not the most talented of flyers. The most action she'd gotten on a broom was flying to the Hogwarts roof and back a couple times a year. And that didn't exactly take the skill of professional Quidditch player to accomplish. However, James, Sirius, and Melody were thoroughly convinced that because Lily had quick reflexes, she should play Quidditch. And this was a dangerous idea because they simply did not understand that every time Lily tried to turn on a broomstick, she fell off. There was no way she would ever make her broom go into a steep dive like she had seen James do 100 times. She would drive herself right into the ground and be sure death by Quidditch was not exactly how Lily wanted to go. James and Lily exchanged a glance and sighed before edging off towards the magazines. They did not want to get into the middle of a beater discussion between Sirius and Melody. Sirius took the club from Melody's hands. It's all right. I've seen better. But if you're going to buy a club for yourself, go with an Earlman. They don't cost much more, and they're much higher quality than... He cut off and stared behind Melody for a moment before speaking. Can I help you? He directed at the tall, imposing man who had appeared behind Melody. Sirius, who are you? Oh, Melody said, turning, her eyes widening as she saw who it was. Oh, indeed, the man replied. Hello, Uncle. Mimi, Matt, and Susie explored the shops of Diagon Alley under Mimi's direction. Susie muttering about her dislike for Melody Caldwell once or twice. Normally, maybe it would not have been so demanding, but she was on a time budget, and her parents would not accept any excuses if she was late. Because of this, she shoved her friends from store to store, buying her school supplies in the most efficient manner, hoping that if she got all of her shopping done quickly, she would have time to simply relax. That was her philosophy anyway, or at least it was her philosophy until she ran into Remus Lupin and Peter Pettigrew outside Flourish and Blotts. Matt and Susie simply rolled their eyes, knowing that Mimi would stay outside the store talking to Remus forever if she could, and they entered and began looking around for their school books. Peter stared rather uninterestedly at a window display as Mimi and Remus carried on a rather lively conversation. Remus was frustrating. She liked him very much, and it was fairly clear to her that he was interested as well. But he was always holding back, always refusing to make his move. She strongly suspected that this was because he was a werewolf. She figured out this interesting little tidbit just before the end of school and hadn't told anyone of her discovery. If Remus wanted her to know, she wished he'd tell her on his own terms. She didn't care that he was a werewolf. Despite wizarding superstition, he was no different from any other human. And besides that, he was one of the nicest people Mimi had ever met, but still one of the most frustrating. Melody took a long, stressful walk through Diagon Alley into the leaky cauldron behind her uncle. Questions were flitting through her mind like a million golden snitches, each grappling for a place in the forefront of her thoughts. Why is he here? What does he want? How did he find me? Am I in trouble? How much trouble am I in? Where's Catalina? Since when does he have a walking stick thing? Did I leave my bag in the Quidditch shop? Hans produced a private room for them in the leaky cauldron, and after Tom had provided them with tea and crumpets, which Melody had no intention of eating, Hans ordered that they be left completely alone and fixed a gaze on Melody, lethal enough to snap a wand. Speaking of wands, hadn't Melody left hers in her bag? She sincerely hoped that between Sirius, James, and Lily, one of them had the good sense to pick up her bag. Well then, Hans said, and Melody's thought process froze. She was just looking at him, unsure of what to say. How very different from their last conversation, in which she'd argued with him like a stubborn mule. Indeed, she said. How interesting to see you again, Uncle. Interesting? Hans chuckled. Yes, Melody dear. I'm sure you'll soon find how many things in this world are quite interesting. Melody was beginning to regain her wits a bit. And what do you mean by that, Uncle? I mean, dear girl, that my life is not as glamorous as you think it to be, and that you are about to find that out right now. Melody did not like the tone of her uncle's voice. It had lost its delicate and courteous tone and had become flat and threatening and menacing. It was amazing the kind of shivers that voice could send up her spine. Just tell me why you're here, Uncle, Melody said finally, daring to look him in the eyes, even though it made her rather nervous to do so. Hans shook his head for a moment before speaking. You are so like your father in ways that you cannot even know. At this, Melody felt a rush of pride. She forgot sometimes that Hans was her father's brother. Hans had been so much older than Melody's father that Melody's father hadn't really known Hans all that well growing up. But they got along well enough from what Melody understood, having Hans compliment her like that, or had it been a compliment, made her proud in a way she almost could not express. Stubborn, proud, foolish, Hans muttered, and Melody's pride faded a bit. Perhaps her father and her uncle had not been as close as she thought. You would not want those traits to be the demise of your family as your father allowed them to be the demise of himself, would you? Melody's eyes bulged. Pardon me? Allow me to rephrase. You wouldn't want to allow your stubborn, foolish pride to be the downfall of your family, would you? Are you threatening my family, Uncle? How obtuse you are at sometimes, Melody. Really. Don't you lay a wand on my family, or what? You'll glare at me? Shoot a few spells at me? That's interesting, Melody. Really. But Just to save on time, I think we better establish that I am the only one who is going to make threats around here. And why would that be? Because, Melody, my dear, I am here to call in your debt. My debt? My debt for what? Please tell me you're not serious. The hotels, the clothes, the meals, the lavish vacations. You invited me to go with you, and you agreed to go. You didn't have to. You can't possibly expect me to pay you back for all that. That's ridiculous. I don't see why. I provided things for you. I expect to receive compensation. Compensation? Melody spluttered. Have you suddenly gone deaf? Yes, compensation, Hans snapped. I fed you, I clothed you, I allowed you to go out and buy all sorts of things for yourself. Don't you feel I deserve something in return? No.
Nope.
I'll send you a nice fruit basket at Christmas. How does that sound? This is hardly the time for sarcasm, my dear niece. I'm afraid I'm deadly serious about this. Well, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. You cannot invite someone to stay with you and then expect them to pay you back for everything you've ever given them. Don't presume to tell me what I can and cannot do. I gave no indication that anything you were receiving was free of charge. Indication? You're telling me about indication? You gave me every indication to believe that I was traveling with you as your favorite niece, and that keeping up with the fashions was all part of the trip. Buying 300 pairs of shoes is not mere fashion. Melody winced a bit at that. She couldn't quite argue in that case. Well, you can have the shoes back if you want, but I'm not giving you anything else. And why would that be, Melody? Spite? Pride? Greed? Or perhaps you were just incapable of returning the garments, the jewelry, the souvenirs? Melody thought for a moment, not at all liking the tone in her uncle's voice that had suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Maybe it's just because you're a greedy old bastard who can't stand being parted from his money. Hans looked at Melody for a moment before doing something completely unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile either, rather a nasty and twisted, and revealed his darkened, nasty teeth. Perhaps, he suggested in an oily voice, you cannot return these things because you no longer have them. Melody froze. This is what she had been afraid of. I thought we'd established, Uncle, she said in a higher pitched voice than normal, that I considered all those things gifts at the time. Do not waste your breath speaking of things we already have established. Do you or do you not have these items in your possession at the present time? Melody looked long and hard at her uncle before uttering the small, deeply significant, painful word. No. No, Hans repeated softly, smiling still wider. That puts you in an interesting position now, doesn't it, Melody? I suppose, Melody replied, gritting her teeth. And what do you propose I do about it, Uncle? I propose that you do exactly as I say from now on, Melody, or you will be treading on some dangerous ground. Would you care to specify, Uncle, or are you going to continue to be cryptically threatening? Melody snapped, unable to take her uncle's menacing hints any longer. Very well, Melody, I'm going to be blunt. I want all my money back, or I'm going to seize possession of all of your family's belongings, including their house, and kick them out of it. Melody, in spite of her mad attempts at self-control, gasped and stared at him in fury. You wouldn't. Hans chose to ignore the pointless comment. Since it doesn't seem likely that you will be able to repay me, I have come up with a solution to fix your indebtedness. Oh, really? And what would that be? Pardoning myself around like a little show monkey? I do have to go to school and be quiet, child. You are not in a position to mock the man who holds your family's livelihood in his hands. Melody chose not to respond, but instead gazed at her uncle stonily. Every good thought she'd ever had about him, everything she'd ever done for him, every nice word that had ever come out of her mouth about him, she'd take it all back now for the ability to hex him into his grave. How dare he? How dare he threaten her family? If she could right now, she would seize possession of her uncle's liver and kidney and sell them on the black market. Her maddening thoughts quickly disappeared, however, when she heard her uncle's solution. Now then, Hans began, there are a few ways in which you can come across a great deal of money in a short space of time. And since I do not wish to earn my money by gambling, playing the lottery, theft, or prostitution, there are even fewer. Plus, since stock investments are too risky and I do not believe you have the skills required to trade on the black market, Melody thought immediately of her plan to sell her uncle's liver, and her lips twitched upward slightly. That leaves me one simple, foolproof solution. Melody, who was still a bit distracted, thinking of the liver, could not imagine what her uncle might be suggesting, unless it was stripping, since that wasn't technically prostitution, but one could hardly make several $100,000 stripping. She looked blankly up at her uncle, waiting. Marriage, he said, savoring the word and smiling at his own genius. Marriage into a very, very wealthy family. Melody froze. Time stopped. The world ceased to function. One thought blazed through Melody's mind. He did not just say that. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She closed it again to think, but her head remained blank. He was looking at her, awaiting her response. She opened her mouth again, wanting to give him a good one, something sarcastic, something negative, something just anything. Oh, was what she said. My. Hans' smile twisted itself wider. Oh my, indeed, my niece. I'll be in touch with you about Christmas, Hans replied, and then left. Melody stared down at the ring with a sick feeling in her stomach. Slowly, she removed it from the black velvet box and slid it onto her fourth finger on her left hand. The sight made her feel even more ill, and she hastily removed it and switched the ring to her right hand before pocketing the box and hurrying out of the leaky cauldron. She didn't want to think about what her uncle had just said, or what her mother would say if she knew about this, or what she might have to go through, or what they might have to go through because of her. She tapped the bricks on the wall behind the pub frantically, wanting nothing more than to escape to the streets of Diagon Alley and forget how severely screwed up her life had just become. Her hands were still shaking like mad when she rushed back into the Quidditch shop. She couldn't quite get her breath under control. Her vision was still a little fuzzy around the edges of her eyes because of the tears that were beginning to sting them. How could someone she trusted so much turn out to be such a fat, greedy, horrible, blackmailing? Melody's thoughts whirled in her head as she hurried through the Quidditch store, searching for James, Lily, anybody, when she found Sirius. He was holding her forgotten bag and considering two different packages of beater gloves when she ran up to him and threw her arms around him, shaking. Sirius dropped the bag and the gloves, yelling slightly from shock until he realized Melody was clinging to him, and then he just said, "Jesus, Melody, what's wrong?" and wrapped his arms around her. Melody didn't respond, just shook her head and buried it into his shoulder. Sirius just stared at her, unsure of what exactly to do or exactly why she was clinging to him. "Melody, what happened?" Sirius asked, but Melody just shook her head again, this time violently, so that her long blonde hair tangled in Sirius's fingers. Lily and James came around the corner, followed shortly by Mrs. Potter. Lily, seeing Melody's less than fantastic state, ran up to her best friend and immediately demanded that Sirius tell her what was the matter. Sirius, who did not know, just shook his head helplessly. Mrs. Potter, who was not about to allow 3 teenagers to stand in the middle of a Quidditch store with a very distressed friend on their hands, blocking up the aisles, no less, gently detached Melody from Sirius and ushered them all to the register. Lily, James, and Sirius, who at least had gotten a sense to realize this might not be the best place to discuss whatever was troubling Melody, all shoved their desired purchases onto the counter at once and practically threw their sickles at the man behind the register and didn't bother to stay and collect their change. Mrs. Potter led them all to Florian and Fortescue's and thought that the place was hideously crowded, managed to find them a 4-seater table, and then wisely disappeared to allow the teenagers to sort out whatever was the matter. She was deadly curious, of course, as to what was troubling Melody, but as all 4 teenagers were currently living under her roof and none of them seemed to have any concept of the word whisper, she expected through a combination of her hearing and the house elves, she would find out what was the matter sooner or later. All right, so I guess that's it for this week.
We'll see you again next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us on our journey through the trapdoor.
You can leave us a review on Facebook or Apple Podcasts. It would literally mean the world to us.
Or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at thetrapdoor16.
Or if you have any longer thoughts, you can shoot us an email at throughthetrapdoor16@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
See you next week.